My name is Claire Winslow. I'm 34 years old. Dump it on her! My brother shouted and without pause grabbed a glass of cold water and threw it straight into my face. The room didn't gasp. No one jumped to stop him, but something shifted. The silence that followed felt like vacuum. Heavy. Dead still. This wasn't a bar. It wasn't a family dinner gone wrong. It was a classified budget review session held inside a restricted military hearing room, the kind with polished wood Six Flags and brass nameplates etched in all caps. Present were high-ranking officers, senior logistics analysts, 2 civilian auditors, and a general. My brother wasn't just a relative here. He was a division lead, one whose name appeared on page 3 of the discrepancy report, and I was seated 1 row back from the central table, exactly where I had been told to sit. No name tag, no title. Just technical observer. No one had introduced me. No one had asked what I was doing here. The glass of water hit my face with full force, a flat slap of cold and humiliation. It soaked my collarbone, ran down the side of my neck, darkened the fabric of my slate gray blouse. The chair behind me didn't move. I didn't scream. I didn't wipe my face. I didn't even flinch. I blinked once. A few heads turned toward me. Most didn't. They turned to the general. He sat at the center of the arc-shaped dais. His shoulders straight, his jaw unreadable. Slowly, without a word, he reached for a sealed file folder stamped internal. On the tab, my name, Claire Winslow. He opened it. No sound but the turning of the first page. I didn't look up. But I felt the shift, the air thinning like before a storm, the growing awareness that something was not aligning with what they thought they knew. I sat there soaked and silent in a room where every breath was recorded and every twitch noted, and yet no one knew the truth sitting in plain sight. No one knew. But they would. Because this wasn't the first time I'd been treated like a disposable piece on someone else's board. But it might be the last. Come with me. To see who I've become. And what happened to the one who shouted for them to dump it on me. The water trickled down the inside of my sleeve. I didn't move. My palms stayed flat against my lap. The wetness cooled quickly under the air conditioning vents that hummed above the security-sealed ceiling tiles. No one said anything. No one offered a tissue. My brother's breath was still heavy from the outburst. He hadn't sat back down yet. His eyes darted to the general, then to the major sitting 1 chair to the left as if waiting for someone to validate his reaction. No one did. My mother, yes, she was there, looked away as if she hadn't seen anything. The stenographer paused slightly, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A civilian official on the far end of the table began to gently reposition his glass, a small, nervous habit that said more than any statement could. He didn't look at me, but one man did, a lieutenant colonel whose name I didn't yet know. He glanced at me once, not with sympathy, but with recognition. The kind of look that only someone who's read the back pages of a file knows how to give. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. I remained seated upright. Not defiant. Just present. It rattled them more than shouting ever could. The general continued flipping pages in the file. 2nd, 3rd, then the 4th. His hands were calm, deliberate. Someone shifted in their chair. A pen clicked. The room had not recovered. My brother finally sat. His jacket clung to his damp shirt beneath. He reached for the glass that wasn't there anymore. A folded napkin was set silently between us. Not handed to me. Not extended with intention. Just placed. Neutral. Non-committal. Like the kind of gesture someone makes when they want to acknowledge harm without stepping into the line of fire. I didn't take it. I didn't need a napkin. I needed the room to stay quiet just a little longer, long enough for them to start asking themselves what exactly I was doing there in the first place. And more importantly, what the general was reading. I stayed still. Let the wetness cling. Let the moment burn. Let them sit in their unease while I offered nothing back. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't move when provoked. I wasn't always the quiet one. There was a time I spoke up. Often. As a child, I asked too many questions. My father used to call me curious to a fault. My brother called it something else exhausting. We grew up in a house shaped by rules, not posted, not spoken, but felt. Rules like don't challenge the person who raises their voice first, don't bring up past wounds if someone in the room still wears a uniform, and above all, don't outshine your brother. My brother Grant was older by 3 years. He had the look tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of smile that worked well in photographs. By 16, he was already being groomed for service. Dad took him to base on Saturdays just to show him how things work. At 17, he wore a junior ROTC badge like a birthright. I was 17 too once, but no one asked what I wanted to wear. They let me pick electives. That was enough. While Grant trained in logistics and field protocol, I took interest in systems not the kind you fire, but the kind that fail silently. Procurement chains, digital redundancies, embedded bias in contracting structures. Even as a teenager, I wanted to know where the money went and why no one ever seemed to care. When I tried to explain that over dinner one night, my father blinked at me and said, "Jesus, Claire, can you just enjoy your food without lecturing the roast?" That was when I learned intelligence was fine, so long as it didn't inconvenience anyone. I didn't stop learning, I just stopped sharing. In college, I studied public administration and later specialized in defense-adjacent financial compliance. It's the kind of field that makes most people change the subject at parties. But I loved it. I loved how everything connected. If you traced the patterns long enough, the truth eventually exposed itself. No one at home asked what I did. They knew I worked somewhere in D.C. That was enough. It kept things peaceful. I saw Grant climb fast through the civilian contractor track. He had charm, and he used it well. He managed projects in base infrastructure, small unit housing procurement for ground support. I stayed away. Our lives ran parallel, close enough to be uncomfortable, distant enough to keep the illusion of harmony. The only times I came home were for birthdays and funerals. The house always felt too clean, like it had been emptied before I arrived. My mother would ask if I was still playing with spreadsheets, and I'd smile. It wasn't that they hated me, they just didn't know where to place me. In their world, a woman should either be support or decoration. I was neither. My father passed when I was 28. Grant handled the eulogy. My name was mentioned once in passing as Claire, who's doing her work somewhere important. That was the closest I'd come to recognition. The year after Grant was appointed to a regional logistics lead, I knew from watching federal contract reports that his name was tied to a few inconsistencies. Nothing glaring, but enough for me to notice. I didn't say anything. I wasn't his watchdog, but I never stopped paying attention. And then, about a year ago, I received a request. It came through a quiet channel, not flashy, not alarming. Just a note asking if I would consult as an independent reviewer on a series of unusual procurement anomalies. I said yes. I was never told exactly where the request originated, but I had a feeling. Sometimes people in high places need someone invisible, someone who knows the system but doesn't wear its rank. I signed the non-disclosure agreements. I was assigned a number, not a title. I didn't know at first that the project would lead me directly into the shadows of my brother's division. When I saw his name on the documentation, 3 contracts flagged, 2 shell vendors, 1 unexplained asset flow, I felt nothing. Just clarity. I didn't accuse him. I didn't avoid it either. I kept doing the work, quietly, carefully, and when I submitted my analysis, I included only what the evidence supported. No embellishments, no assumptions. Just numbers, dates, links. My supervisor wrote back 2 words. Well done. I thought that would be the end of it. Then came the subpoena. Then the internal hearing. Then the invitation to observe. No one told me Grant would be in the room. No one told him I would be either. Maybe they thought it would resolve itself, that I'd stay quiet as always, that blood would override truth. But I'd learned somewhere along the way that silence only works when it protects something worth preserving. That day in the hearing room, I didn't come to accuse. I came to confirm. And he made his own choice. He shouted. He threw water. He revealed everything I didn't have to say. The moment wasn't a rupture. It was a conclusion. The culmination of every skipped question, every averted eye, every dinner where I kept my mouth shut. My brother had been trying to drown me for years. This time, I let the water land. And I didn't move. The hearing did not adjourn after the water hit my face. That more than anything told me how these people worked. Had I screamed, Had I stood and flung something back, maybe the chair would have been cleared. Maybe the room would have erupted. Maybe someone would have pretended to mediate. But because I stayed seated, still soaked, I became part of the furniture again. Wet, but silent. Not a disruption. Just an uncomfortable detail they could overlook if they tried hard enough. I watched the general turn another page in the file. His brow lowered slightly, but he didn't speak. He didn't look at me. He didn't reprimand Grant. That silence echoed louder than the outburst. Grant returned to his seat, breathing heavier now. His face was still flush from adrenaline. He didn't apologize. Of course he didn't. That would imply guilt. And Grant had always been skilled at stepping over guilt like it was a sidewalk crack. The civilian auditor, 2 chairs down from him, cleared his throat and attempted to resume the presentation. His voice cracked on the opening word. No one mentioned what had just happened. Not even a sideways glance. It was as though it had been folded into the official record as background noise. I stayed still, outwardly, but inside, something was moving, a click, a shift, not rage, not even humiliation, just confirmation. This was who they were, all of them, even the ones who didn't throw water, especially them, the ones who looked away when someone is targeted, the ones who stayed neutral when truth turned ugly. My mother sat in the back row. I could feel her there before I ever turned around. She had always been good at hovering just out of reach involved, but never entangled. Present, but passive. She wouldn't say anything after this. She wouldn't call. She wouldn't ask how I was. At most, she'd send a short text, "Let's not make this bigger than it was." She always said that. About everything. The hearing moved on. Charts were shown, figures questioned, timelines dissected. My presence was ignored. Not just dismissed, deliberately excluded from any reference. They didn't want to legitimize me by naming me. That was fine. Legitimacy doesn't require acknowledgement. It just requires the truth to exist, whether they look at it or not. The real conflict wasn't in the documents. It was in the choreography of the room. Each person playing their part. Each person pretending I hadn't changed the temperature just by sitting there. Because if they admitted it even a little, it would mean Grant's story wasn't whole anymore. And Grant's story mattered to them. Because they'd invested in it. They'd approved it, promoted it, benefited from it. To question him now meant questioning themselves. So instead, they questioned my motives. After a short recess, one of the defense liaisons approached me with a forced smile. "I'm just curious," he said. "What brought you into this process?" It's not often someone from outside the project loop is present at this level. His tone was friendly. His eyes weren't. I met his gaze. Contractual request. Standard rotation. He tilted his head, feigning interest. Assigned by request came through audit compliance. Tiered authorization. I'm sure it's in the file the general's reviewing. A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. He hadn't expected me to know how to answer. He backed away with a nod. Just wanted to say, welcome. We're all trying to find clarity here. Clarity. That word in their mouths always meant control. But I didn't need control. I only needed to be the thread they couldn't untangle. By the end of the second session, I'd received 3 side glances, 2 thinly veiled comments, and 0 direct acknowledgments. Not one person said what happened earlier was unacceptable. Not one person asked, "Are you all right?" Not one. The general stood and called for a second recess. He didn't look at me, but he didn't close the file either. That told me everything. I remained seated for another minute before stepping out into the hallway. The corridor was empty, lined with military-grade carpet and soundproofed doors. I walked to the far end, where a small waiting alcove held a cooler of water and some disposable cups. I poured one, took a slow sip. My hands didn't shake. I stared at the condensation forming on the plastic and thought about all the years I'd stayed silent, not because I lacked a voice, but because I knew the power of waiting. And in that silence, I had learned everything about how men like Grant operated. Loud, convincing, and utterly fragile beneath it all. They depended on rooms that would always absorb their messes. But now the room was different, because I was still in it, still soaked, still quiet, still watching, and not leaving. I stayed in the hallway until the cooler ran dry. The last cup of water warmed in my hands. I didn't drink it. I just held it something steady to anchor myself while the world rearranged in silence behind the heavy double doors. I could hear muffled voices inside. They were laughing again. Someone had made a joke. Someone else had responded. It was amazing how quickly discomfort faded when the person humiliated chose not to disrupt the order. I could have left. I could have walked straight down the corridor out past the front gate, caught a ride to the train station, and vanished back into whatever invisible pocket they always expected me to crawl back into. No one would have stopped me. No one would have called. And for a moment, a full, terrifying moment, I considered it. Not out of defeat, out of something darker. What if I wasn't the person I thought I was? What if I had built my entire identity around being the one who endured, the one who never flinched, and all it amounted to was this being soaked in silence, being looked through by the very people I used to try and impress, being tolerated but never trusted, present but never included, capable but never invited. The doubts weren't loud. They didn't scream inside me. They whispered, maybe you were wrong to show up. Maybe you mistook necessity for belonging. Maybe your presence here is not proof of strength, but proof of arrogance. I walked into the nearest restroom and stared at myself in the mirror. My blouse had dried slightly at the shoulders, but still clung damp around the collar. My hair had settled oddly with strands curling where the water had lingered. I looked tired. Not devastated, just quietly worn. There's a unique exhaustion that comes from being invisible and resented at the same time, like occupying a space no one acknowledges, but everyone wants you out of. I ran a paper towel under warm water and pressed it gently to my neck. I tried to think of someone, anyone who would have stood up for me in that room. No one came to mind. Not my brother, not my mother, not the men with credentials clipped to their jackets who once shook my hand in neutral meetings and told me I was refreshingly detail-oriented. No one. That realization settled in my stomach like a stone. Maybe I'd been wrong about everything. Maybe quiet competence wasn't respected. Maybe it just made you easier to ignore. Maybe all my years of restraint had looked like absence. And maybe the worst part wasn't their failure to see me. It was mine. Because somewhere along the way, I had started believing that being strong meant being silent, that dignity meant never asking to be defended. That value would eventually speak for itself. But here I was, still soaked, still alone. And for what I leaned against the counter, both hands pressed to the cool marble. I imagined myself disappearing, not dramatically, not with a slammed door, just fading out, letting the room resume without the awkwardness of my presence, giving them the ending they wanted, the quiet girl who couldn't take the pressure, the sister who proved them right, the woman who should have known better, and I almost did. I almost stepped back into that role. But then a different thought, quieter, still emerged. Not a voice, not an epiphany, just a memory, a fragment from years ago, a moment when I had been called into a conflict resolution in a desert outpost. The meeting had turned volatile. A contractor had accused a local liaison of fraud. Tempers were high. No one trusted the room. And I had sat exactly like I had today, silent, observing, waiting. And when it was time, I'd spoken 3 sentences, and the entire tone of the room had shifted, not because I yelled, not because I had power, but because I carried truth that no one could dispute, delivered calmly, precisely, with no hunger for dominance. It hadn't made me a hero, but it had ended the chaos. That was the gift I brought into rooms like this. Not volume, not spectacle, just presence, measured, unyielding. And now, even in this moment of doubt, that part of me was still intact. It was buried beneath disappointment, soaked under humiliation. But it was still there, waiting. So I stood. I fixed my hair. I straightened my blouse as best I could, and I walked out of the restroom without looking back at the mirror, because I didn't need to see myself to remember who I was. I just needed to return. Not for them, for me. When I returned to the hearing room, no one looked up. It was almost admirable, the collective effort to pretend nothing had happened. My chair remained in the same spot, damp from earlier. No one had wiped it. No one had replaced it. I sat anyway. Let them feel the wetness by proximity. Let them wonder if it would stain. The general didn't acknowledge me, but he hadn't closed the file either. That mattered. We resumed. More charts, more layered defenses. An independent consultant brought in to contextualize discrepancies was introduced. He wore a dark suit and spoke quickly, burying his narrative in jargon. I recognized the tactic. Drown the truth in words. Dilute precision with plausible confusion. It might have worked if no one else in the room had seen what I had. But I had the original records. Not all of them, but enough. And more importantly, I had the one thing no one else in that room seemed to carry: memory. Not just data points, connections. I didn't speak during the next 2 hours, but I made notes. Silently, carefully. I matched statements with dates, linked justifications with prior audits, flagged references that contradicted earlier testimony. Not to expose. Not yet. To be ready if the moment came. Across from me, Grant fidgeted with a pen. He wasn't calm anymore. Not because of what he'd done to me. That didn't bother him. But because something was shifting. I could see it in his eyes, the slow crawl of uncertainty. Not panic. Not yet. But discomfort. Like someone realizing the rules of the game have changed and they were the last to find out. He glanced at me once. Not to intimidate. To check. And when he saw that I was writing, not staring, not stewing, just writing, I saw the first real flicker of fear, because he knew my handwriting. He knew what it meant when I started connecting things. He leaned toward the man next to him and whispered something. I didn't care. I didn't need an audience. I needed accuracy. That's what strategy looks like when your weapon is clarity. You wait, you observe, and you prepare to move with precision, not fury. At the next recess, I approached the assistant from compliance who had handed out folders earlier that morning. She stiffened when she saw me. "Ma'am," she asked. "Page 16 in the summary packet," I said quietly. "The revised cost projection for Q3 doesn't align with the figures approved in the March addendum. Cross-reference Annex B." She blinked. "It's not in the slides," I continued, "but it's in the footnotes. The discrepancy isn't large, but it sets a pattern." She nodded, eyes sharpening. I handed her my note, just a page, with 3 bullet points and 2 file codes. "I'm not submitting this as evidence," I said, "just context." She took the paper carefully. Understood. No one else saw the exchange. That was the point. Sometimes power doesn't enter the room loudly. Sometimes it's the quiet reminder that someone is watching and that someone understands what they're seeing. I returned to my seat. Grant hadn't noticed. The next segment began. A new analyst presented a risk overview. It was meant to be dry, just procedural language. But now the room listened differently. Because small things were beginning to shift. Because I hadn't stormed out. Because I hadn't fought back. Because I was still sitting here, not silenced, not enraged, but deliberate. That's when strategy becomes visible. Not when you strike, but when others start repositioning themselves out of your line of sight. I saw it in posture. The way one official shifted her chair just slightly toward me. The way another began to quote data more carefully, double-checking the page before speaking. The way Grant stopped interrupting. I didn't make them nervous. The truth did, and I had never needed to shout it. I just needed to remain and let their certainty unravel on its own. Because they had prepared for denial. They had braced for confrontation. They hadn't prepared for endurance. They hadn't prepared for someone who would stay after the damage, quietly, relentlessly taking notes. Someone who knew that vindication never comes in applause. It comes in the slow, steady collapse of a lie under the weight of what it couldn't erase. The final session resumed after lunch. The room was colder now. Literally, someone had adjusted the thermostat. But I could feel another kind of chill, too. Not temperature. Tension. Something had shifted during the break. A new air of restraint. Voices were lower. Statements were more carefully worded. Grant hadn't said a word since returning. He no longer looked toward me. Not even a flicker. His confidence, the easy grin, the casual entitlement had dissolved into something quieter, guarded. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know what game we were playing anymore. The general still hadn't spoken my name, but he hadn't left the file either. It remained open on the dais, now halfway through a red tab sticking out near the back. The stenographer kept typing. A colonel from Compliance Command began the closing remarks. He stood at the head of the room, hands behind his back, posture rigid with the kind of ease that only came from decades in structured environments. His voice was smooth, practiced, but firm. As we complete the review of the identified discrepancies and external assessments, he began. We acknowledge the contributions of independent auditors and field analysts whose diligence made this process possible. He paused. My breath stayed low. No one turned toward me. Not yet. Among those, he continued, is one whose analytical cross-checks and multi-phase validation framework laid the foundation for what we now recognize as systemic misclassification patterns within 3 procurement lines. He looked up. His eyes met mine. Direct. Unflinching. Claire Winslow. He said clearly, your data integrity report was the anchor of this review. No one moved. I didn't blink. A flicker passed through the room, not a gasp, not a murmur, just stillness, as if the walls themselves had paused to listen. Grant's jaw tensed. The general shifted slightly in his seat, not surprised, not alarmed. Simply finished waiting. He lifted one hand and turned the last page of my file. A brief silence followed, and then, with deliberate clarity, the general spoke. Ms. Winslow. He said my name finally, please stand. The stenographer stopped typing. I stood. Not dramatically, not with defiance. Just calmly. The way I had done everything else. He continued. This file confirms Tier 3 clearance authorization and full procedural compliance. It also verifies your appointment as a lead-level auditor under Internal Referral Protocol 7-9. No one had known. Now they did. He wasn't asking permission to say it. He was documenting it for the record. The colonel added, all findings referenced in her report are considered foundational. Any disputes should address the data, not the individual. It was subtle, but undeniable. I had been invisible for so long in that room, sitting silently soaked, unacknowledged, that they had forgotten I could shape the outcome. Now they were being reminded. And I didn't need to say a word. Grant didn't look up. His pen was still in his hand, but it wasn't moving. His grip had gone tight knuckles, pale. For the first time in years, he wasn't performing. He was hiding. Across the room, someone whispered. A second person coughed the kind of awkward, unplanned sound people make when they realize they're not sure what happens next. But nothing happened next. Not immediately. Just stillness. Just me standing. The general closed my file. Slowly, carefully. Thank you for your service, he said. That was it. Not applause, not a promotion. Just a sentence. But it was everything. Because he knew what it cost to sit in that chair and never interrupt. Because he knew what I had absorbed without ever letting it break me. Because he knew who I was even when no one else had bothered to ask. I nodded once, then sat back down. No celebration, no victory lap. Just presence. That was the confrontation. Not shouting, not revenge. Just the truth spoken aloud by someone whose word mattered and who chose finally to say mine. They didn't look at me when the session ended, not because I wasn't there, because now they couldn't pretend I wasn't. A few of them began shuffling their papers, busying themselves with folders and quiet whispers. Others stood too quickly, as if movement might dissolve the discomfort still settling in the room. The colonel stepped away from the podium, his face blank again, folding effortlessly back into the procedural role he knew so well. But he'd done what needed to be done. He'd said my name, and with that, the silence had changed color. No longer the silence of neglect, but the silence that follows an undeniable truth. The general had already left. A quiet nod toward me had been his final word. It was enough. It was more than enough. I stayed seated. Let them move first. Let them decide how to navigate a room that no longer bent around Grant. He stood eventually slowly, not with confidence, but calculation. He adjusted his tie. But when he turned, he didn't meet my eyes. He walked past me just a half step too quickly, and for the first time in our lives, he didn't say a word. That was the moment I understood he wasn't afraid of being exposed. He was afraid of being seen, because exposure implies drama, headlines, fallout. But being seen, truly seen, meant being known in a way you couldn't script your way out of. And now, he knew I saw him. All of him. Not just the inconsistencies on paper. Not just the aggressive charm he used as armor. I saw the smallness underneath. The fear behind the performances. The boy who had grown up convinced that power meant being louder, faster, bolder, and who had no idea what to do with someone who didn't play the game, who didn't shout, but didn't leave either. That scared him more than anything. I let him walk. That was the reveal not just of me, of him. They thought I was the one with something to prove. But now the roles had reversed. He was the one who would have to explain, to justify, to spin, because now the official record didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to facts. It belonged to the numbers. It belonged to someone who had been watching all along, not to destroy, but to preserve what the rest of them had forgotten mattered. Integrity isn't loud. It doesn't wave flags. It survives in the places no one wants to look. I gathered my notes slowly, careful not to rush. A few aides hovered near the door. I caught one of them glancing at me not with contempt, but something closer to curiosity, as if wondering how someone like me had ended up here unannounced, unassuming, and yet undeniable. I nodded once before walking out. No one followed. Outside, the corridor stretched long and fluorescent. My heels echoed against the tile, steady and sharp. I didn't look back. In the lobby, a younger officer approached, clipboard in hand, unsure if he should interrupt. "Ms. Winslow," he asked quietly. I paused. "Yes." He handed me a sealed envelope. "They said this is for you. Internal documentation packet." I took it. He hesitated before adding, "It was an honor to watch." Then he turned and disappeared through the double doors. I stood there for a long moment, envelope in hand. Not because I didn't know what it was, but because I did. Not promotion, not reward, just documentation. The official trail. The verification that I had existed in this space, not as a footnote, but as a name in the index. That I had left something behind that couldn't be erased by silence. It was enough. I didn't need more. Recognition isn't always applause. Sometimes it's a closed envelope, a quiet nod, a hallway that doesn't echo rejection anymore, and the knowledge that the person who once shouted over you now walks past you quieter than you've ever seen him. That's the reveal. Not a twist. A reckoning. I didn't go back home right away. Instead, I checked into a quiet guest house 3 blocks from the train station, the kind of place with heavy curtains and no questions asked at the front desk, a space built for rest or maybe disappearance. I sat on the bed for a long time that night, still in my work clothes, still holding the envelope. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. What I wanted wasn't inside those pages, not really, because I hadn't come for vindication, and I hadn't stayed for revenge. I had shown up for one reason, only to remember that I still could. That I could enter a room where no one expected me sit down beside those who once erased me and remain long enough that silence no longer belonged to them. That was the lesson. That presence, quiet, consistent, intentional, changes things. Not right away, not with spectacle, but in time. The next morning, I folded the envelope and placed it into the back of my notebook. I checked out. I walked down to the station and boarded the early train out. No one called, no one texted, not even Grant, especially not Grant. And I didn't need them to, because when they threw water on me, what they didn't realize is I didn't melt, I didn't shatter, I didn't even move, because I've spent a lifetime learning how to hold the line while others unravel. And now that they had seen it, they didn't know what to do with me. That was the gift, not their apology. Not their recognition, just their unease. They would think twice the next time they tried to break someone in silence. They would remember the woman who said nothing but stayed anyway, the woman who carried truth like a blade she never had to draw. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my actual work, the one no one in my family ever asked about, the one I never advertised. I sat in windowless rooms again. I reviewed documents. I refined structures. I did what I was trained to do, not because I needed power, but because I understood the cost of power left unchecked. And on quiet days, I'd remember that hearing room. Not the humiliation, not the pain, but the moment everything turned when someone finally said my name and no one could pretend I didn't belong. That was enough. There's a kind of freedom that comes after a reckoning, not loud or triumphant, but clean, quiet, steady, whole. I didn't send thank you notes. I didn't debrief with anyone. I didn't even tell my colleagues what had happened. They didn't need to know, because what changed in that room wasn't just the perception of me. It was the understanding I had always carried that you don't need to match their volume to hold your ground. You don't need to make them see you. You just need to see yourself clearly enough that they can't unsee you. And when they try to erase you from the room, you don't yell. You stay, long enough that your presence rewrites the narrative itself. They wanted me gone. They wanted me small. They wanted me erased. But instead, I walked in. I stayed seated, and I became the margin they couldn't adjust, the note they couldn't redact, the line they couldn't close. So no, I didn't get a seat at their table. I never needed it, because when they refused to make room for me, I built a table of my own. And this time, no one gets to throw water on it. No one gets to throw me out.